Who here feels called? You have a calling? Like 2. I'm very excited for that. Who here feels that they have purpose? A lot more. That's great. All right. We're making progress. This is going very well. When I was 19 years old, I was looking for a purpose. I was looking for a calling in my life. I had dropped out of college. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And I was grasping for anything, really. And I heard about this, a Vista lineman school. And I thought, I think linemen make pretty good money. That sounds like something that I would like. And the school has a great reputation. So the application process is you apply, you go into a facility with all the other applicants, and you do a math test and then an interview. And out of 50 or 60 applicants, they pick just a handful of people to come into that class, which I think they do once or twice a year. So it's hard to get in. I go in there, and I take the math test, and I'm the first one done, and I get a 97%. I think I'm killing it, right? And then so in the interview, you walk in, and if I remember right, I think there was 5 guys on the other side of the table from me, and then laid out on the table were like these nuts and bolts and stuff. And at the end of the table, they had this piece of wood, and they said, this is what's like at the top of a power pole, like where the power line goes through, and we want you to try and put it together. There's no wrong way to do it. We just want to kind of see how your brain works. And so I, put the bolt in and some nuts and washers on, whatever. And they told me that I actually put it on in the right order. I just did it like upside down. So again, I thought I was doing pretty good. I didn't get in. 2 nights before that, I had gone out drinking with my friends and passed out drunk at a house party, and one of my friends shaved off one of my eyebrows. So, of course, that came up during the interview. And I was scared, so I lied, and I said that I burnt it off trying to light the barbecue. I heard one interviewer whisper to the guy next to him, that's not all he was lighting up. And I just knew that I blew it. They saw me for what I did and not who I was. You see, our decisions do impact our destiny. No matter how big or how small the decision may feel at the time, it has an effect. And we are called as Christians to be a holy people, a righteous people, God's chosen people that are faithful and obedient in all things, big and small, in order to fulfill our destiny as God's chosen righteous people. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what we're called to be. The title of the sermon is A Call to Priesthood. That is what we are called to do. Corey ended last week with the conclusion of chapter 4, proclaiming Jesus as our high priest, as an approachable high priest. And that may seem odd or confusing or strange or totally irrelevant because we don't have high priests today. But to the original readers of this text, it would have been very relevant, and they would have known exactly what this meant. You see, the high priest was the mediator between man's sin and God's glory, because we cannot commune with both sin and God at the same time. We need a mediator. And what we need to understand is that this is never what God wanted. God never wanted to be separated from his people with the need for a mediator to go between us and him. God wanted us to be his chosen people, his called people. He wanted us to walk in his blessing and in his presence with our face turned towards him and our heart turned towards him at all times. He wanted us to be his royal priesthood. So we're going to continue reading in chapter 5, verse 1. If you have your Bibles with you, please turn to Hebrews chapter 5, phone, tablet, whatever way. It's really helpful if you follow along. And I also just want to mention, are you guys reading these chapters before each Sunday? Because we're doing this in a very predictable order, one chapter after the next. So after this sermon, you guys can read chapter 6 next week. Very excited to hear about that. And I hope that some of you studied and read chapter 5. This is confusing stuff. Hebrews is a very dense book, and I hope that when you read through it, you can gather some questions and that you want to seek some more understanding so that when you come to church on Sunday, God can speak to you through that, right? That's the intention here. So, verse 1 says this, "For every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sin. He can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is also subject to weakness. Because of this, he is required, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer sacrifices for sin. And no man takes this honor to himself, but he who is called by God, just as Aaron was." So there's two qualifications that we see here. Did you catch what they are? To have compassion and to be called. That was a requirement for a high priest. Called by God and a compassion for people. We have the same requirements, don't we? We have to have a heart for God. We have to be called to do God's work. And we have to have a heart for people and have compassion. The problem is that man never fully meets the requirements for this. Man always falls short. Man never fulfilled what God wanted for his people. Unfortunately, time and time again, we see where man tries and fails because of disobedience. Here's a couple examples. A man named Korah. This is found in Numbers chapter 16. Korah was a wealthy man. He was from a good family. He was a relative of Aaron. Aaron was the high priest, and Korah thought that Aaron was doing a bad job, and Korah thought that he could do a better job than Aaron. So he decided that he was going to go and offer his own sacrifices, and he ultimately, you guys know what happened to Korah? The earth opened up and literally swallowed him and all of his co-conspirators. He could not be obedient to what God wanted because of jealousy, right? The next example is King Saul. King Saul has a long story in the Old Testament, but this part comes from 1 Samuel chapter 13. And in this part of King Saul's story, the nations are at war, people are dying, people are fighting, things are not going well, and King Saul wants a sacrifice to God to try and help him. And he's waiting for Samuel, the high priest, to come back. Samuel said, "I'll be back in 7 days." Well, he waits 7 days, and Samuel's still not back. So King Saul goes into the temple and offers a sacrifice, which was a no-no. He should have waited. As soon as he does that, Samuel shows up and says, "What have you done? The Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not continue." Basically, God no longer sees you fit to be king. See, King Saul was disobedient and missed out on his calling because of impatience. And then the third example is King Uzziah. King Uzziah was a very successful king. He won battle after battle. He overtook land after land. He won war after war. He built tremendous walls. He built tremendous towers. He had a tremendous army, 300,000 men strong. They had the best armor. They had the best weapons. He was very successful. In fact, in 2 Chronicles chapter 26, it says, he made devices to be on the towers, to shoot arrows and large stones. I imagine like a Gatling gun of arrows on top of the towers. That's pretty cool. This is like a long time ago. He became so strong and so successful, though, that it led to his destruction. He decided he didn't need the high priest and he can go and offer a sacrifice himself because he's so great. So he goes into the temple, he offers a sacrifice of incense, and at that moment he is struck down with leprosy. And then he had to spend the rest of his life living in isolation, all alone, because that's what lepers were banned to. He couldn't be obedient, and he missed out on his calling because of pride. All of these men tried to circumvent God's plan and God's purpose for his people. They tried to step into priesthood with jealousy, with impatience, and with pride, and it didn't work out. Man fell short. Man would always fall short. That's why God sent Jesus. Jesus would fulfill what no man could. And as we read on, in verse 5, we get a description of how Jesus is qualified. Remember the qualifications? Called and compassionate. So verse 5 says this, "So also Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he who said to him, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you.' As he also says in another place, 'You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. So this is saying that he is called. This is a quote from Psalms talking about the coming Messiah, and it says, you are a priest forever. So God is saying you are a priest. He is called according to the order of Melchizedek. Who the heck is that guy? He is barely mentioned in the entire Bible. He takes up about half a chapter in Genesis, and he hung out with Abraham back then. And this was important to the early Jewish Christian readers of this text because they would not have looked to Jesus as a high priest because he wasn't from the tribe of Levi. He wasn't a part of the Levitical order where Aaron was from, where all the high priests of that time were from, were in that line. Jesus was from the tribe of Judah. He was a descendant of King David. They would have never looked to him as a high priest. That's why this has to be mentioned there. There's another order of high priests, the order of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek might sound like a mysterious figure, but he is very important, and I'm not going to talk about him too much because chapter 7, 2 weeks from now, is a lot about Melchizedek, and Corey is going to explain to us how he's relevant and what he means to us today. But for these people, it was just simply Jesus is called. That's the first qualification. So next, we read about he is compassionate. That's the second qualification. Verse 7, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who is able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear. Though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. And having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him, called by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. So he's compassionate. I think that this is a picture of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Vehement cries and tears to him who is able. Jesus is calling out to God, Lord, take this cup from me. He is about to face torture. He is about to face the cross. He is about to face the sin, the shame, and the judgment of the entire world. And ultimately, he was about to face separation from God. And he is compassionate for you because he has literally felt your sin. He paid for every single sin. When you lied to your spouse the other day, he paid for that sin. When you looked at that website you probably shouldn't have looked at, he paid for that sin. When you went out drinking the other night and had one too many, even though you know you shouldn't have, he paid for that sin. When I went out and got my eyebrows shaved off, he paid for that sin. He felt it. He felt each and every sin of the world, including yours, and not just your past sins, but your future ones too. We need to understand that. And he is compassionate to mankind because he knows and he understands literally what you're going through, what you struggle with, and ultimately he knows what that leads to, and that is separation from God, and he knows what that feels like, and he knows how painful that is. Jesus is compassionate, and he is called. He is qualified to be the high priest. And we look to him as our example because he fulfilled what no man could. The writer of Hebrews makes a pivot here. About halfway through the chapter, the focus shifts from talking about the qualifications of a high priest and how Jesus fulfills those qualifications to talking to us. And this is really the first time in the whole book of Hebrews that the writer turns towards the audience and starts speaking some personal correction. Verse 10 says, this is going back to verse 10, still talking about Jesus, called by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, of whom we have much to say and hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. It's a very interesting passage. The writer is saying, I have a lot to tell you. This guy Melchizedek is important and you need to know a lot about him. But first, we need to deal with something in you. You have become dull of hearing. You have become dull of hearing, which implies that at one point you were sharp of hearing. It implies a regression. It implies that you have slipped back. You have allowed something to happen, and it needs to be addressed before we can move on. Verse 12 says, for though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. and you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. We need to understand that as the writer turns to us, who he is talking to. Check this out. 1 Peter chapter 2 says, this is chapter 2, verse 9, but you, talking to us, are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. We are chosen. We are his royal priesthood. Christ restored the communion that God desired with his people. So this is a warning to the royal priesthood to not become disobedient to the qualifications of priesthood. Do not become disobedient to your calling. Do not become disobedient to compassion. Don't become dull. Stay sharp so that you can progress in your faith and not regress, so that you can move forward in your faith and not move backwards. This means moving backwards and drinking milk means always needing the most basic things taught to you again and again. It means always needing your foundation re-poured, which the basic principles and the milk is not bad. These are good things. These are the foundation of the faith, and that is where we need to start. But you should mature, and you should move forward. You should be growing. You should be maturing. It was a couple months ago, I had this realization as I was preparing for a different sermon that I was really understanding what the Bible was saying, what God was speaking to me. I was able to read the text and understand it and pull nuggets out and felt like I was knowing and understanding God in a deeper way than I ever had before. I understood his calling for my life. I understood my purpose, and I felt like I was walking it out. And I started looking back at like the last 10 years, and I've thought that before. I've thought, man, I'm really getting it now. But as I look back on that Taylor 3 years ago, he did not get it, but I'm getting it now. And I was sharing this with Karen, who has a couple years on me, and she said, it's the exact same thing for my life. As I look back, I always thought I got it, but then I got it more, and then I got it more. As you look back in your life, you should see progress. You should see steps. You should see your faith building on itself and getting better and getting deeper. It's so exciting to me to know that there's no end. You never arrive. You never know God all the way. You never understand God all the way. It is unending, and that's exciting to me that as close as I feel to him right now, there's more, and there always will be more. So we have to be obedient to our calling and obedient to our compassion. So how do we do that? We look to Jesus as our example. He fulfilled what no man could, so we look to him. Let's look back at verse 8. It says, he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. So how do we be obedient? How do we learn obedience? It's through suffering. Now this verse really strikes me. It says, he learned. What? Jesus learned something? Isn't he God? Doesn't he already know everything? I mean, the Bible says that the universe was created for him. The universe was created by him. So doesn't the universe already obey him? Doesn't he already know what obedience means? How can he learn that? And what I think this is implying is that he experienced it. You see, it's different to know something than it is to experience it. I can know what the symptoms of coronavirus are, but to actually experience loss of taste and loss of smell is something crazy. And you don't really fully know it until you experience it. It's different to experience something than it is to know it. And I think that Jesus experienced obedience through suffering. There's no suffering in heaven. He experienced suffering for the first time when he took his first breath on this earth as an infant. And he was obedient in that. He experienced obedience as an adolescent, obeying his parents. He experienced obedience as a young adult, working as a carpenter, obeying his superiors. He experienced obedience as a Messiah on the cross. He was obedient in not only the big things, but also the little things. And that is our example, obedient in all things. In order to walk as God's royal priesthood, we must be obedient in all things, big and small. This is our call to righteousness. God's royal priesthood is called to 100% righteousness in all things. Now, I think it is easier to be obedient in the big things, right? Like, I can draw the line at murder. Like, I'm very obedient in that. I don't do that. But it's a lot harder to be obedient in the little things. It's the little things that make us slip, isn't it? It's the little things that the enemy tells us aren't really that bad. It's the little things that say, it's okay just this once, or no one's going to notice. Everyone does it, it's okay. But that's the deception of sin. The devil is a liar, and he doesn't want you to know what he's up to. It always starts with something small, and you never see the end when you start. You know, if I knew that, looking at this one website, this one pornographic website would lead to me looking at another one 6 months later, and that would lead to me looking at another one 3 weeks from there, and that would lead to me looking at another one the next day, and then the day after that, and then over and over, and then that would lead to my wife discovering it, and that would lead to the biggest fight of my marriage, and that would lead to divorce, and that would lead to me never seeing my kids again. I probably wouldn't have done it from the beginning. We don't see the end. Sin lies to us. It's not a big deal. If I knew that going to that party where I passed out drunk and got my eyebrows shaved off would lead to me not getting into my Avista school, I wouldn't have done it. But we don't see the consequence. That's the trick of it. But we are called to be obedient in all things. Jesus was obedient in all things. But how? It's hard. So again, we look to him as the example. Let's look at what the end of chapter 14 says here. Chapter 5 says here, verse 14. But solid food belongs to those who are full age. So now we're moving into what does it look like to be mature? That is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. So those who are mature in their faith and obedient in their faith and walking out God's holy priesthood are identified by use of their spiritual senses. By exercising, that's what it says, by use, exercised their spiritual senses. It's a skill that has to be developed, that you must be obedient to, that you must learn and master. So if Jesus is our example, how do we learn something? How do we learn to be obedient to something? Through suffering. That's what verse 8 says. It's in the suffering that we learn. This is a warning to not grow dull, and I think that it's in the suffering that we grow sharp. I think it's the suffering that sharpens us. And I know that that doesn't sound like fun, but most things worth learning take sacrifice, right? Have you ever seen somebody just like totally kill it on a musical instrument and think like, man, I would love to be able to do that? As somebody who's not very musically talented, I'm drawn to people who are really good on the piano. And when I see someone just tickling the ivories, I think, man, I'd love to be able to do that. But I cannot just will myself into masterful skill, can I? No. What does it take? It takes time. It takes commitment. It takes dedication. It takes perseverance. It takes a little suffering. It's not easy. You got to push through, even when it gets hard. You got to overcome obstacles. You have to sharpen yourself through suffering. And that is how you get good at something. That is how you develop your skills that it's talking about, identifies you as a mature believer. If you can't push through the suffering, you will go back to needing the most basic things again. You will become a babe, is what it says, and not like a babe, like a baby, okay? A child. Children are amazing and they're innocent. And I love the way they act. But it's not cool when an adult acts like a child, is it? It's not okay to go back. So let's apply this to our qualifications of priesthood. What are they again? Called and compassion. Because we have a warning to not grow dull in these things. So how do we stay the course, endure the suffering, and become sharp in our calling, in our compassion, and our call to God? And here's the big point that I want to get across. I think that we can grow dull in our call to serve God, and I think that we can grow dull in our call to compassion because of suffering. I think it's the very thing that is supposed to sharpen us that we allow to dull us. It sounds like this. I avoid showing compassion because it makes me be vulnerable, because I have to put myself out there, because I have to put in effort. It might not be received well. Last time I did it, I got hurt. I avoid showing compassion because I might suffer. We allow the fear of suffering to take us back and dull us. Or how about this? I avoid my calling and I avoid serving God more because I don't have time. If I were to serve God more, that would mean I would have to give something up. And I just don't really have anything that I can or want to give up. If I were to give up that, I would really suffer. We allow the suffering to take us back and dull us. And it's this mindset that will continue to bring you back and need the most basic things and need milk over and over. You allow the fear of suffering to take you back to where you started. Instead, what God wants for you is for you to learn from the suffering, right? That's how Jesus learned. He learned obedience through suffering. That's what God wants for us. So lean into the suffering. Embrace the suffering. Look forward to the suffering. If it was the tool used to teach Jesus obedience, who are you to say that it's not for you? You're too good for suffering. Okay. It's how Jesus learned obedience. If it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. Let me tell you that right now. Remember those 3 guys we talked about in the beginning? They lost their obedience because of, remember what they were? Jealousy, impatience, and pride. It's a saying sometimes that we can suffer from these things, right? I can suffer from impatience. I can suffer from pride. I can suffer from jealousy. So isn't that an opportunity to learn? I think that is now an opportunity to either grow dull and give in, or grow sharp and increase in your faith and break through to the next level and grow closer and grow more deep in understanding about who God is. You can learn obedience from whatever you're suffering from, but it's in the resistance to sin that the lesson is learned. If you give in to your fleshly desires and let the jealousy take over, let the pride take over, or let the impatience take over, you will go back. We're going to sing one last song here, and I'm going to ask you all to please stand as I close with this last thought. Let's check your qualifications for priesthood. Let's do a little self-check here. Are you compassionate? How do we find out? Are you serving people? This is one of our biggest calls as Christians, right? To treat others as ourselves. What are you doing to show others love? What are you doing to pour yourself out into other people? Are you doing it at all? Let's check your calling. How do we do that? Are you serving God? Or, now I'm talking to mature Christians here, are you just a consumer of Christianity? There's this big church in California called Saddleback, started by a guy named Rick Warren, and he has a very interesting philosophy on those who attend their services. He wants the seats in his church to be open and available for seekers, people who are wanting to come and learn more about Jesus. He wants the good news to be heard by people who have not heard the good news, which is a commendable thing for a pastor to want. But the part that strikes me most is if you are already attending a different church and you've been a Christian for a long time, he doesn't want you taking up a seat in his church because it's taking it away from someone who could learn about Jesus. If you're a mature Christian and you want to attend his church, he expects you to jump in and serve in some capacity. So where are you? Where are you serving? Where are you showing compassion? And I just want to say that if you don't know how to serve in this church, please come find me after service and I will help get you plugged in somewhere. If you don't want to come talk to me, there's little cards in the seat back in front of you. And you can just fill one out. There's things you can circle. I want to serve here. I want to serve here. Drop it in an offering bucket and we will get a hold of you. But this word is a warning that if you're not serving and you're not showing compassion and you're not being obedient to your royal priesthood calling, you are growing dull. The big lie that the enemy tells us is that there's nothing on the other side of suffering. The enemy will tell you that suffering goes nowhere, will be in vain, and will only cause you hurt and heartache. But what God is telling you is that there is something on the other side of suffering. There's breakthrough. There's another level. There's a deeper understanding. There's learning obedience on the other side of suffering. So don't give in to the sin and lean into the suffering and obey God in it so that we can be his royal priesthood with our hearts turned towards him, what he has always desired for his people. If you can trust that there's something on the other side of suffering, you can walk as God's royal priesthood.